U.S. President Donald Trump says that the Iranian nuclear program is destroyed. The Iranian regime acknowledging that it has suffered significant damage. However, we are seeing reports coming out of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, here in the United States, leaks coming out that perhaps the nuclear program was not set back far enough. Lots of discussion right now swirling around on both sides of the Atlantic. We're still trying to parse this out. We're still trying to figure out just what was accomplished in those strikes first carried out by Israel over the course of almost 11 days. Then we have the capstone strikes from the United States knocking out 3 facilities. But again, unclear whether everything was accomplished that Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu set out to do when this war began. Meantime, Israelis coming back to whatever normal looks like after a year and a half of war. They spent 12 days in shelter. This was a harrowing week and a half for Israelis, almost 2 weeks for Israelis. They're getting back to normal today and starting to sift through the rubble. We have some tough news coming out of the Gaza Strip this morning and a little bit of confusion as it relates to the home front command. Lots to unpack here today. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Executive Director here at FDD, and I've got with me today Jonathan Conricus, Senior Fellow at FDD, former international spokesperson for the IDF. We've also got Brad Bowman, the Senior Director of our Center on Military and Political Power, and a guy who knows a few things about the U.S. military. So we've got a terrific lineup here for you this morning, and we're gonna keep going with this SITREP format for the FDD Morning Brief through at least the end of the week, because there is just too much for me to unpack on my own, and we just need more help. So we've got the right people to help us this morning. Jonathan Conricus, I want to turn to you first. I want to ask you about exactly what you are seeing right now in Israel. This has been a tough week for you and a tough week for 10 million other Israelis. You've been in shelter. You've been waiting for the bombardments, these ballistic missiles, to stop penetrating Israeli airspace. Even though a lot of them were neutralized on their way in, a lot of them did get through. There's damage that Israel is sifting through this morning. There are deaths. There are injuries. There's PTSD. What is happening right now? What is your assessment of how Israel has come out of this on the other side?
Yeah, good morning, Jonathan. Thanks for having me on. A pleasure always. A challenging more than a week. The numbers that are the most important, I think, are actually the amount of Israelis that don't have a home, that have been forced out of their homes because their houses were hit directly by Iranian ballistic missiles. We're talking about a good few thousand Israelis that are currently in temporary housing, hotels, or living with family. And that, I think, is the bottom line. There's lots of other numbers flying around. The amount of drones that were fired at Israel and intercepted, 99% out of 1,100 incoming UAVs were successfully intercepted by Israel and its allies. The success rate of the Arrow and all of the other components of the Israeli air defense is somewhere between 80 and 85%, which is very high. But then each and every ballistic missile that got through created tremendous damage on the ground. We have one national infrastructure facility that was severely damaged. That is the oil refinery in Haifa. 3 Israelis were killed there, and significant damage was done, actually taking that facility out of production. And we now have a serious issue with oil refinery and everything that relates to the oil industry in Israel. Not so much spoken about, but serious impact there. And bottom line, in terms of Israelis, I was very fortunate. The only thing that me and my family had to do was run up and down to shelter. Something similar to what the Wall Street Journal's correspondent Shana in Israel reflected on YouTube. But for me, it's been relatively easy. For many Israelis, it's been a very, very difficult situation. I think moving forward, Israel relies on many layers of security and active protection and passive protection. Up until now, the saying was, and the working assumption was, that if you're in your shelter, you're going to be safe from whatever is impacting around. Sadly, we have had 5 Israelis killed in 2 separate incidents. They were in their shelters, closed doors, and they were supposed to, not be significantly damaged. But unfortunately, a direct impact of a ballistic missile carrying between 500 and 600 kilograms of explosives simply obliterated those safe rooms. So there will be structural and other consequences for this war in terms of the Israeli home front. But if we step aside from that for a second, we're coming back to the reality of continuing the fighting in Gaza, with sad news about 7 Israeli soldiers that were killed in one incident in the Gaza Strip in Khan Yunis. We're coming back to political realities and bickering and infighting in between the different parties and the different elected officials, getting back to the toxic debates. And of course, getting back to the reality of having still, despite dealing the Iranian regime quite a significant blow, which I'm sure we will assess, still having lots of terrorists around us that we need to defend ourselves against. So I would say, to summarize, it's been a very eventful 12 days. Israelis, I think, are brushing themselves off under significant attack, but by and large, Israeli society holding strong and capable of dealing with the pressure, because we are battle hardened. And now looking forward and seeing, okay, where does this take us in terms of Gaza, in terms of Hamas, in terms of direct relations or issues with the Iranians? Lots of questions, and but I'm happy to see Israelis going back to work, shops opening, schools are back. Not happy to see the traffic that is associated with that, but you can't have it without that. And Israelis are brushing themselves off and carrying on with work.
All right, that's a great summary of, I think, what's going on in Israel right now, and I thank you for that, Jonathan. Now, I do want to turn to this this BDA, this battle damage assessment, and the ongoing iterations of all of it. I want to get to Brad in a minute for the U.S. side, but I do want to hear from you, Jonathan. I know you're plugged in to the Israeli security establishment, and I understand that what we're seeing right now is a discrepancy between what the Israelis have assessed, what the U.S. president is saying, and what we've heard from the DIA in this leaked report. And let me just say, when we see leaked intelligence out of any system, the Israeli system, the American system, it is designed to be politicized. It is designed to be weaponized. There was a message that was trying to be conveyed. Now, we understand this morning that Pete Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense, is now looking for the source of that leak, and that they will be looking to prosecute whoever has released that information against the will of the United States. It was a violation of their job, right? It was a violation of their security clearance. But for right now, Jonathan, let's just try to zero in on what the Israelis are saying. I understand that what they're not saying is that, the way that Donald Trump put it, that the entire nuclear program in Iran was obliterated. They're also not saying that it's a matter of months before the nuclear program gets online. So it's somewhere in the middle, which is what I would expect to hear from the Israelis. And I think, at least from what I've heard this morning from the folks that I've talked to, it's still not a clear picture. It's still pretty fuzzy right now as they collect information about loose enriched uranium, as they look for perhaps some of these secret sites that were not hit, that maybe need to be hit. But what is your general sense of what was achieved by the U.S. strikes and the strikes before that by the Israeli Air Force?
Yeah, this is not Osirak of 1981, and it's not Deir Azur 2007. When BDA was, we were capable of doing that very quickly, and it was pretty straightforward. The bombs hit their target, the targets were destroyed, and that was more or less the end of the story. The Iranian nuclear weapons program was much more dispersed. It had much better defenses. It was much more clandestine, and therefore the BDA will take longer. And I said this yesterday in a TV interview. We just have to be patient, and I agree with you 100%. Anything coming out in the coming days and maybe even weeks is political for one purpose or the other. I think we'll just have to be, contrary to what's fashionable these days, we'll have to have patience. We will have to wait for real intel to be collected on the ground or based on other sources, and there is an abundance of sources that Israel is tapping into, and then create a more comprehensive understanding and assessment of what actually happened. The assessments that I hear are from the IDF, and they're talking about very good strikes on targets, and that the initial BDA is overwhelmingly positive. Which doesn't mean that everything was totally obliterated and it'll take the Iranians 15 years to go back to trying to produce nuclear weapons. But I think the cumulative effect of scientists, and that is the number one, I think, issue that so many in the Western media are not addressing, and those people at the Defense Intelligence Agency, they didn't take that into account at all. But scientists with centuries of knowledge and expertise in weaponization, super important that they no longer are around, and all of the cumulative effect on equipment and facilities. So I would say that the first assessment from the IDF is very positive, but Mossad people, I don't know if they're on the ground collecting information or not, but I would say that Mossad and IDF is very busy collecting intel. And I think it's interesting to hear that the Iranians themselves, an hour and a half ago, issued a statement that their facilities were severely damaged by the American strike. But the bottom line is what matters. I think broad, comprehensive damage was done to their program. It's also, and that's my last word, how fast, how long will it take them to rebuild or do what they want? That, of course, depends on how much resources they will spend on it and if they will do it. And, of course, what we would need to try to force that to happen is that the Iranian regime will understand that it's not in its interest to do so and get into an agreement that has oversight and inspection, and where the Iranians acknowledge and say, we are not going to try to enrich on Iranian soil. And then, however successful the strike was or wasn't, will be less relevant, because that will be the path forward.
Okay, another great summary. I think, the only thing that I would just add here is just the logic of what has just happened here. There is the psychological deterrence now that, I think the Iranian regime is not immune to, right? They know that they're being watched. They know that they have no air defense. They know that the U.S. is capable and willing to attack if they cross a red line. They know the Israelis are more than willing to do that, as they did for more than a week and a half before the U.S. intervened. On top of that, no conversion facilities. On top of that, massive amounts of centrifuges are inaccessible or destroyed. I mean, and look, I'm not a nuclear specialist. I will be the first to see that, but by logic alone, you begin to get the idea here that this is not something that the regime is going to be able to easily replace, or that it will have the will to do so right now. And I want to talk about the will in a minute, but Brad Bowman, I want to bring you in here because you've worked in the Pentagon. You have done battle assessments. You've looked at this stuff, open source. I know you guys are looking at it right now. Some of the imagery that we have in this new center that we've stood up here at FDD, new program, looking at satellite imagery. I want to get a sense from you about what you're seeing, both from the political level, right? The leaks and the intent to try to influence the public debate, the public utterances from the White House, the official statements coming out of the Pentagon. It's a lot of noise. How do you kind of crystallize this in a way for FDD Morning Brief listeners and watchers to understand what's going on here? What is the middle ground that we should be looking at?
John, thanks for the opportunity to join you, and thanks for the great question. It's wonderful to be here with my good friend Jonathan, who, as always, just gave, I think, a superb rundown and largely aligns with what I'm hearing and seeing, and our independent analysis as well. Here's the bottom line up front, as we like to say in the U.S. military. Battle damage assessments, BDA, the term that every American is learning, are ongoing, but Israel's nuclear weapons program has been seriously degraded, but not completely destroyed. Full stop. There it is. Seriously degraded, but not completely destroyed. And as someone who worked in the U.S. Senate for 9 years and has had 15 years in the U.S. Army and had a top clearance for most of that time, big surprise that this is being weaponized. Big surprise that everyone wants answers right now. In our microwave culture, we want everything in 30 seconds. I'm sorry, that's not how battle damage assessments work. Students of military history, anyone who's been engaged in military intelligence operations understand that the first report is often wrong. So it is neither true that this was a failure, it was not, and it is also not true that the program was totally obliterated. Sorry, sports fans, the truth is in the middle, as it often is, that this was seriously degraded but not completely destroyed. Battle damage assessment is continuing. That's imagery intelligence, which everyone is familiar with, the satellite images, signals intelligence, human intelligence, look into the Israelis for a lot of that. And here's one that maybe you haven't heard of, MASINT, or measurement and signals intelligence, where you're looking at acoustics and geophysical. So there's all source intelligence being conducted. The Defense Intelligence Agency put out leaked a report that was illegal and should be found out and punished. That's inappropriate. But let's put that in perspective. That's one of about 12.5 of U.S. intelligence agencies. The DIA is excellent. There's a lot of patriotic Americans there. They don't always get everything right. So take that with a grain of salt. David Albright's report yesterday over at the Good ISIS aligns with what I'm saying. Massive damage, they say, quote unquote, significantly set the program back, various levels of damage and destruction, but some unknowns. The status and location of the enriched near weapons grade uranium, 3 to 5%, 20%, 60%. Where is it? How much it was destroyed? And the centrifuges that were manufactured but not installed for Natanz and Fordo. Where are they? And what is the degree of damage at Fordo? So anyone who's saying they know exactly what the status is in Fordo, I think doesn't, unless they're in deep into the intelligence community, don't know what they're talking about. We had 14 massive ordnance penetrators drop. That's the GBU-57s, 12 at Fordo, 2 at Natanz. They did serious damage. But we're just going to have to be patient and see what happens. And then I'd love to talk about the ceasefire, John, if you want to, and kind of ongoing sources of the long-term conflict and how most of those remain undressed. But I'll take a breath there.
Yeah, thanks. And that's exactly where I wanted to go next. By the way, I'm just watching my screen right now. Israelis are reporting that 218 education institutions took damage, right? Just as we start to parse through exactly what's happened here to Israel, I think they've emerged victorious. I think they've dominated the Iranians, but there was a price for this, which I think we always understood from the Israelis, that there was going to be a price to pay for the operation that they were eventually going to carry out against the Iranians. I understand, by the way, that from my friends in Israel, they're telling me that the damage was far less than they had anticipated. But let's talk about the damage to the regime and to the regime's proxies, right? When we look around the region right now, Lebanon stayed quiet. Iraq stayed quiet. Syria stayed quiet. Even the Houthis were pretty darn quiet throughout all of this. So when you look at what's gone on here, I mean, it was pretty quiet out of Gaza too. A tough morning this morning from an Israeli perspective. But overall, it felt like that 7-front war kind of narrowed down to one front for the last 12 days. And that, I think, has had a significant impact on that kind of wider scope of the war. So if I can get you, Brad, to just talk to us for just a minute about, A, how much damage did the regime incur when we look at kind of what happened over those 12 days and the Israelis just hammering hundreds and hundreds of targets, sorties day and night, going after key pillars of the regime. And then let's broaden that out to take a look at what the rest of the region looks like.
Yeah, sounds good, John. Thank you. I'll try to be very quick. What the Israelis did, obviously in April last year, and certainly even more so in October, and then what they've done over the week and a half or so was just incredibly impressive. The near simultaneous taking out of scientists and top military leaders demonstrates a degree of penetration, intelligence capability, and military prowess that is extraordinary. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, to hit one of those individuals is a feat. To hit so many within such a short period of time, I would say would not, if I were in the regime in Iran, which thankfully I'm not, would not leave me feeling very comfortable. And so Jonathan's point earlier about how centuries of knowledge has been taken off the battlefield in terms of their nuclear weapons program, I completely agree with that. The blow to to the military, to the nuclear weapon sites. It is very, very significant. This was absolutely a tactical operational success. Whether it is a strategic or grand strategic success, I think will be determined by what comes next at the negotiating table, where we know the regime is particularly capable and there's a tendency on the American side to adopt bad deals. In terms of the axis, the so-called axis of resistance, honestly, when I was looking at possible retaliations, the number one thing I was looking at was the Iraqi militias. I suspected that we'd have less or nothing in Syria because of what's happened there with Assad and the new regime and the serious blow to the Iranian presence and prowess in Syria. I was most concerned about Iraqi militias targeting American bases there. That's the dog thus far that didn't bark or bite, if you will. And we saw after October 7th, and we did this big tracker, me and Cameron McMillan at FDD, where we documented over 180 attacks on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria by Iranian proxies, with sadly a very few American retaliation. And we saw that turn on or off, demonstrating the more or less the command and control of Tehran. So that what appears to happen, Tehran did not say, hey, Axis, hey, what's left of Hezbollah, hey, Houthis, hey, Iraqi militias, it's go time, it's go time. They didn't do that. Why did they not do that? It's conjecture, it's informed conjecture. I would say it's because they understand that the Israelis can strike any target on the surface in Iran at will with precision, and so can the Americans. And so if you're in that position, right, they had to respond, but you're careful about the response because you know that you're doing so, if it's too much or you have American casualties, per what Donald Trump said, we were going to come back and rock their world. So they're in a new place here in terms of understanding their own vulnerability. But I am not holding my breath that the fundamental sources of the conflict, the four sources that I highlighted in X post yesterday, all of those remain in effect to some degree and remain unaddressed. And I'll just end with this. Not all ceasefires are good. Okay, I'm so glad that the ballistic missiles for now are not going at Israel against our best ally in the Middle East. But I remain concerned that the main sources of this conflict, all of which reside with the regime in Iran, remain fundamentally unaddressed.
Yeah, so let's talk about those. Right, we've got the nuclear program itself still unresolved. You got the missiles still unresolved. You got the proxies still unresolved. And then you've got the regime itself. I mean, the sort of ultimate driver, the ideological engine of all of this still intact, right? So these are the core issues that we're dealing with right now. So Jonathan Conricus, let me turn to you first for the Israeli perspective on this. What do the Israelis want to see out of whatever, I don't know if it's Doha or Muscat or some other traitorous ally of ours in the Middle East? They're going to host these conversations, right? These people, by the way, should not be hosting these talks. They are not disinterested parties. But nevertheless, that looks like where we're going to go. What are you looking for? What should the Israelis be trying to get out of these talks? And do you think that any of that is feasible?
Yeah, so I very much agree with what Bradley is saying. As always, words of wisdom, grounded on facts and not conjecture, which is very refreshing these days when we hear so much information of people who don't know what they're talking about. But I would say this. I think this is a great opening act by Israel in a watershed moment in Middle Eastern history, where for the first time at a strategic significant level, Israel, for at least 12 days, took its position behind the driving wheel and was actually dictating events. And by its military excellence, I dare say, really reshaped and redrew the battle lines in the Middle East. And if Israel is smart, and if Israel will be able to continue to coordinate its operations and actions with the U.S. at the same level or close to the same level that we saw the Israel and U.S. coordinate events before June 13, then I'm hopeful about the future. But as Bradley said very correctly, the Iranian regime has a long and pretty successful track record of using diplomacy and negotiations as a tool to further their political and military and strategic aims, and Israel does not, I'm afraid to say. We are many times good on the battlefield, but many times we don't translate our tactical and operational achievements into long-lasting agreements. The exception would be perhaps looking at the current situation in Lebanon. There's a ceasefire. Israel is enforcing the implementation of the ceasefire very strictly and aggressively, and Hezbollah is forced to comply, and good things are happening with the Lebanese state in internal dynamics in that country. And I think that, by the way, that was main or an important part of the reason why Hezbollah decided not to get into the battle. But what I think Israelis are looking at now, there's still an ongoing debate in Israel about the regime, whether or not Israel should have a clear and outspoken goal to weaken that regime and to eventually try to create the conditions or help bringing about the conditions for that regime to fall. So there's a debate about that. All of the things that you said about missiles, about funding and arming terrorist organizations, and about the overarching, the paramount ambition of the Iranian regime, which is to annihilate the state of Israel, they have not changed. And this is just the opening, very exciting and important, but this is the opening act of what I think is a longer and bigger story, which I hope will end. I personally will hope that it will end with the fall of the Iranian regime and with good, positive things happening in the future for Iranians and for the Middle East. So at this time, we're back to political debates in Israel, and I think more or less there's consensus that this was well done, well decided by the government, well executed by the defense establishment, and now we have to continue. There is worry, and I very much agree with what you say, Jonathan. The interlocutors here and the fact that Qatar, that nefarious state supporter and of terrorism, has so much credibility and so much influence in what's happening is not a good thing. And the fact that President Trump seems so positive towards that country and continues to praise its efforts, etc., is not a good thing, because they are not a benign actor. They are negative. They promote terrorism. They incite violence, and they are definitely aligned with some of the more negative forces in the Middle East, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood on one end or politically aligned with the Iranian regime on the other, even though the two are sometimes opposed in other parts. So to summarize, I would say it's a mix of hopefulness and happiness with the achievement, but some dread about where the diplomatic deliberations are going to take us eventually.
Yeah, a great summary again. I think when we look at possible outcomes here, I think, you have the possibility of, just a surrender, right? But I think that is a low possibility given the nature of this regime. I don't think they're going to want to cede defeat to the United States or Israel. That is not the nature of this regime, and I wouldn't expect it. I think that from there, people are talking about the possibility of, the people rising up, the Crown Prince of Iran calling from Paris for the Iranian people to do that. Haven't seen it happen yet. There's the possibility of some kind of internal coup, right? Some kind of IRGC internal officers rebellion when they look at the collapse of the Ayatollah's regime and their inability to defend against Israel and the United States. I've got to imagine that there's some people that are pretty frustrated there. But I do think that we may actually be steering into this weird place right now where the regime stays in power. They are unstable, and that the threats, many of these threats still remain, but that Israel and the United States remain vigilant. And it would look very similar to what's been happening in places like Lebanon or Syria. Of course, the difference being is that with Lebanon and Syria, they're right on Israel's border. And so for Israel to be able to strike at something that makes them nervous or that they see as a threat, it's easy to scramble a jet, an F-35 or a squadron of them, and to have them fly clear across the Middle East and then to attack Iran, only to then see the Iranians firing ballistic missiles in response at Israel. This is the kind of scenario that I think we're all worried about, that we could fall into this thing where, the conflict re-erupts on occasion as Israel takes care of problems that it sees developing as the regime perhaps tries to reconstitute any one of its military or nuclear or other programs. And so this is, I think, the scenario that I'd like to see avoided. But Brad, final question to you before we wrap up. From the U.S. perspective right now, the sort of diplomatic dance that I think we're about to start here, what are you looking for? I mean, we talk about Donald Trump as the deal maker, right? But we also know that the negotiations that we've seen thus far have been hit and miss. Let's just put it that way, right? We didn't really achieve much. The fact that the Israelis launched on day 61 after Trump gave them 60 days was actually an indication that the negotiation channel was not successful. So what are we looking for now as we go back into negotiation mode? Is there anything that can be achieved with this regime?
Thanks, John. Let me start by saying that once again, I respect Jonathan's admirable kind of self-reflection on the challenges that Israel has had at the negotiating table. And I would take that's what true professionals like Jonathan do. And I would do the same thing for the United States. I would apply basically everything he says to the United States. And I'm borrowing a bit here from Lieutenant General retired H.R. McMaster, who's chair of our center. The United States since 9/11 has struggled severely, struggled is a nice word, to convert battlefield success to sustainable political outcomes that serve the national interest. That has been a major weak point for us. And we are in danger of doing that again if we don't watch a few things. Let me run through them quickly. We got to be wary of Iranian diplomacy and agreements that do not address the fundamental sources of conflict that we keep referring to, that provide Iran, as Mark Dubowitz has said, a patient pathway to a nuclear weapon, and repeat the mistakes of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement. Number one, you gotta watch that like a hawk. We should not make preemptive concessions to Iran to start negotiations. I don't know, like supporting Iranian oil exports to China. We know how Iran will use those revenues to oppress the Iranian people, ballistic missile program, nuclear program, terrorism, attacks on us, Arab partners, and Israel. We should watch Iran's actions very closely at Pickaxe Mountain, for example, this other site that was not hit, and several other sites, and what they do at Fordo and some of the other things. We got to monitor closely what China and Russia are doing to help Iran. I hope everyone saw the meeting of the Iranian foreign minister where he expressed that support for Iran. That support could take multiple forms: intelligence, even weapons, advanced aircraft, air defenses. Watch that closely. Watch the ammonium perchlorate shipments from China. That's going to help Iran rebuild its ballistic missile program. We got to bolster U.S. military lethality. This strike that we did was incredibly impressive, but I've thought for years it would take not one impressive strike, but multiple over days or weeks to be effective. So big surprise that we didn't destroy the program with one, albeit impressive, strike. And we got to bolster our regional force protection because we could have worse days ahead when Iran rebuilds. Almost done here. We got to act to replenish Israel's air-launched precision-guided munitions. They expended a ton. They're building some of their own. America's got to help Israel rebuild its air-launched precision strike munitions and its air defenses, both replenishing the Arrow interceptors and helping to increase their air defense capacity. They can do a lot of that on their own, but not all of it on their own. They need our help. And then finally, because I believe what a good deal requires an end to their Iran's nuclear weapons program and no enrichment in addressing their strategic ballistic missile arsenal, this regime, I'm sorry, will never agree to that. They will not agree to what we need for American and Israeli interests. So that's why I believe Mark Dubowitz is exactly right, that we need a comprehensive maximum support campaign for the Iranian people so that they can finally have a government that's focused on the welfare of the Iranian people rather than exporting terrorism. So those are the 7 things I'd watch going forward.
Wow. 7 things. All right. Just a handful.
Sorry, I did that quick too, didn't I? I tried.
That's right. Well, no, look, I think you guys have provided really just indispensable analysis here for us as we try to make sense of everything that's gone on over the last 24 hours. Obviously, the news cycle has been dizzying. The conflicting reports continue. It's a battle of narratives. And of course, those narratives don't actually matter at the end of the day. What matters is the truth. And we are still trying to get to the truth of what happened. We're trying to get an accurate BDA, an accurate battle damage assessment. We're still working on that. That's going to be the result of the Israeli channels, the U.S. channels, perhaps other intelligence services also weighing in, those that are concerned about the nuclear program. We're heading down the path of diplomacy now. This is going to be a very different kind of diplomatic path because we now see leverage on the part of Israel, leverage on the part of the United States. But as I think you both have indicated today, you need to use that leverage. You cannot cede the initiative back to the Iranian regime. They will try to take advantage of all of this. We need to make sure that they don't. We're going to keep watching all of it here. We're going to keep tracking what's going on in Israel as they assess the damage from those 1,000 drones, from those 500 plus ballistic missiles, from the damage that was incurred as the people defiantly come out of their shelters, shrug off 12 days of war, and get back to the business of trying to keep their country safe, fighting to get back the hostages in Gaza, trying to make sure that what we just saw transpire doesn't happen again for years and years to come. Lots of challenges ahead. Want to thank you both for joining us. Jonathan Conricus, Bradley Bowman, thank you for joining us today. We're going to have Jacob Nagel with us on Friday. Jacob is a former national security advisor to Benjamin Netanyahu. He actually also just recently had a committee that assessed the weaponry that Israel is going to need for the future in order to ensure its safety and survival. We're going to talk to him about all of that and much, much more. But for now, I want to thank you for joining us on this very special SITREP edition of the FDD Morning Brief. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.